So, Bob, you work in dialectical behavioral therapy.
Dialectical.
Dialectical behavior?
That's really cool. Dialectical behavior therapy.
DBT.
Yeah, DBT, but is it behavior or behavioral? I should know that, shouldn't I?
Let me look it up real quick. So, I thought we would do an episode about it so we could find out exactly whether it's behavioral or behavior.
This might be a short episode.
Dialectical behavior therapy.
That makes sense. Behavior therapy, right?
I didn't tell you that that's what we're going to talk about today, but would you enjoy talking about it with me? Would you?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Who are you, Bob?
I am Bob Gettle. I'm your old friend from graduate school from way back when, and a counselor here in Seattle as well.
And if you're looking for one of the best therapists around, you can hire Bob, but you have to be in the Washington state. But you would go to bobgettle.com.
Thank you.
So DBT, what is it?
Yeah, right. A treatment that was originally developed to help people with suicidal and self-harm impulses not kill themselves.
Okay. And you've been doing DBT for a long time, like 15 years or something?
Almost 20.
20 years?
Yeah.
And it was developed by Marsha Linehan. Was she working at the University of Washington at the time?
Originally, she was in Stony Brook. She's New York, and then she was at the American University, which is D.C., in D.C., and then she moved here, I think, in either the late 80s or the very early 90s.
Okay. And she has self-disclosed that she suffers from borderline herself, right?
I don't recall her saying that exactly.
Oh.
She has a history of self-harm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And she developed a integrative therapy that was evidence-based that had elements of cognitive therapy, behavioral therapy, mindfulness, and is that the main integrations?
Yeah.
And developed a very prescriptive therapy manualized approach that isn't open-ended. You know, there are tasks and worksheets, and it's primarily a group therapy model, correct?
Well, it has two components. One is individual counseling, and the other is skills training, which tends to take place in a group format.
Okay. And it was originally developed to help people who were doing non-suicidal self-injury and having suicidal ideation.
Yeah, her original goal was to help people not kill themselves. That's the population she wanted to work with. And because it's linked to borderline personality disorder, what I heard her say once is when she started, she didn't know anything about borderline personality disorder. She just wanted to help people not die.
Okay, she wanted to. That's interesting. I didn't know that. So it wasn't about non-suicidal self-injury. It was mainly about suicidal.
I think both.
Oh, both. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm guessing over time she started realizing that many of her patients were borderline, and decided to learn more about that and how this model might work with borderline in general, not just with suicide and preventing death, but also with emotional regulation and bettering your relationships and coping skills and all this kind of stuff, right?
Well, it's true. But originally, she came out of the 80s, and in the 80s, assertiveness training was all the thing. We work in a faddish kind of field, and that was the fad back then. And her original plan was to teach people to speak for themselves, because she figured if they could speak for themselves properly, that would have an impact on, these behaviors that she was trying to help people with.
Interesting.
And so she did. She started out teaching assertiveness, and indeed, that's still part of the skills curriculum. But what happened is her clients would be like, yeah, all well and good, but they call her in the middle of the week and they'd be like, I'm in crisis now. So what do I do? And so from that, she developed another part of her skills training, which is called distress tolerance, which is about how to survive without making life worse.
Okay. Tell us about that.
Oh, okay. It comes in two flavors. The first part is crisis survival skills, which are nuts and bolts skills. I really like them. I like them in part because everybody already knows them, but most of the people that show up in DBT have a habit of mind that's self-critical, as do, I think, most people.
Yeah.
Anyways, and fail to recognize...
I know, I'm the worst at that.
Kirk's being ironic.
Yeah.
Anyways, how was I saying? I've lost my... people already know these skills.
Yeah.
But in DBT, they have all this jargon, and the jargon is only useful, in my opinion, because what it does is it gives a person a frame to recognize the things that they're doing that are skillful. So I say to my students, half of what we're going to do here is reinforce what you already know and do, and half what we're going to do is teach you something new. So
is DBT typically done in the way that you do it in terms of the groups and the individual and the particular modules that you walk people through? Is that the typical format?
Yeah, standard DBT has two components. One is individual counseling, which is very similar to sort of standard Western CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Once a week?
Usually about once a week. It could be more or less depending on someone's acuity. And then it has this other component, which is skills training, which tends to take place in a group. And then the other bit of DBT is that therapists work on a team so that nobody is carrying the load alone. So therapists who have clients in the skills class attend the weekly meeting, and the skills trainers, that's me, attend the weekly meeting too. And there's a coordination of care.
So you're the group counselor person, and other people are the individual counselor.
Yeah.
Do sometimes people do both roles?
Yeah.
Okay.
Occasionally, I'll have somebody in my class who is also my individual client.
And group is once a week?
Yeah, once a week, 2.5 hours.
And like 10 people?
8 students, and then me and my co-teacher, Terry Jaworski.
Okay. And I didn't know Terry was doing it.
Yeah, about 7 years now, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because he used to do it with another friend of yours.
Noel.
And so how many groups do you have?
I run 2 each week, both on Wednesdays.
With 8 people?
8 students each, yeah. Long class, 2.5 hours is one class.
You're saying students because, why? You've told me this before. But.
Yeah. I have this thing. I have it really because of insurance. If I'm impaneled on an insurance, if I'm hooked up with an insurance, right, and I call it group therapy, I'm bound to accept the rate that the group therapist, that the insurance company will pay for group therapy, which tends to be very, very low and not nearly what I need to make in order to actually make the thing work, because I got to pay 2 therapists.
Like $20 per client or something.
Yeah, for what they call a 90-minute session, and we do a 2.5-hour session with 2 therapists.
And so they don't pay for that extra time, so you're getting 160, maybe $200 from the including the copay and everything.
Yeah,
like $200 ish for 2 people working 2.5 hours plus prep time and setup and you have to rent like a pretty big office to have that many seats, and sometimes you don't have 8 people, and so that's not a sustainable model. So you call them students instead.
So what I did is I changed the way I think about it, and I call it a class, which is not group therapy. And if I'm honest, I actually believe that it is not group therapy. It's not group therapy as I understand it. But I don't get so bent out of shape about that anymore because I'm not on any insurance panels, so I don't have to kind of play a game.
So people pay out of pocket.
Yeah.
How much do they pay per session? Per group?
Yeah, we don't charge per session. We charge, but that's okay because it breaks down to $90 a class each. For each of 8 students.
Okay,
and we charge it like a college class, which is a pretty weird way to do anything in the counseling field, is to pay up front for a service you haven't gotten.
Like tuition. Yeah,
like tuition. We really treat it like a college class, and yeah.
And it's not group therapy to you because why? Because
it's curriculum based as opposed to person based.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means that we teach a very specific curriculum. It really is a class. We spend an hour on homework review, we take a little break, then we spend an hour on material which comes out of that manual. And
The official Marshall Linehan DBT manual.
Yeah, which just got republished, updated.
What's
and
it called?
republished. It's called Skills Training Manual for Borderline Personality Disorder.
Oh, interesting.
It might be called DBT Skills Training Manual now, something like that.
For borderline, specifically.
Its original title was, Skills Training Manual for Borderline Personality Disorder.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So is it a good way to make a living?
Yeah.
Is it... Sounds stressful, kind of.
It has been.
Yeah.
I've been doing it a long time now. And I can honestly say that when I started, I sucked. But the thing about...
how did you suck?
I was not flexible enough. I was too pushy and too hell-bent on what it is that I thought people should be doing, my students should be doing, and not flexing enough and not actually reinforcing their practice in a way that made them feel good. And I didn't run the class in a way that made people feel good about being there and feeling safe. And I'd say that right now, the thing that we do best is that we make it a place people like to come, where they really genuinely feel supported by one another and by us. And I am far less pushy.
Mm. Was it based on your understanding of DBT at the time?
Yeah.
You just... that's what you thought DBT was to be fairly prescriptive and not attend too much to the experience of them in the group.
Yeah, which when you say it like that, it sounds ludicrous, but indeed, I think the problem for me is that I read that treatment manual and I was sort of on my own to kind of learn how to do it, and I have a bias. So I have this overlay about what it is to be a student and the kind of student I used to be when I was in school.
Compliant and loyal.
Yeah, which basically describes my upbringing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when your students or clients weren't like that, you were didn't care so much in the beginning, but now you do.
I would get irritated.
You get irritated,
yeah.
But now you really do spend a lot of emotional energy on making people feel heard and go at their pace and more collaborative.
Yeah, and I quite frankly, I admire my students. I think they work very hard, and they often do not do what I would like, but that's life, right? That's everybody's life. But they do amazing and extraordinary things, and I find you get more out of paying attention to what people do than paying attention to what they don't do.
So this is a year-long thing? So people pay for a year of this individual / class that they will probably spend, so 2.5 hours a week in class and 1 hour a week in therapy.
Yeah.
And do they ever go longer than a year?
Occasionally, people will. The way we have it set up is a person can do a 6-month follow-up. The curriculum takes 6 months to work through, and everybody goes through twice. That's the researched model, and so I'm not messing with that.
So meaning that you go through it through 6 months, and then you start over again.
Yeah.
And do the exact same thing, even as if you had never done it the first time.
Yeah.
And there might be new people in the group that second time.
That's true.
People can phase in at the 6-month mark. Okay.
Well, they phase in and out all the time. Like if I start in April, I'll graduate in April. But if I started in June, I'll graduate the next June. And so our group is always changing.
You can start anywhere in the 6-month, but to you know where it starts.
Yeah.
But to other people, they might start on chapter 10, go to chapter 20, go to chapter 1, and then end on chapter 9.
Exactly.
And it doesn't matter because each chapter is a standalone thing that doesn't require you to have the previous chapters.
That's correct.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's a fairly convenient model to follow. So and do people generally stick with it for 12 months?
Yeah, I'd say our graduation rate's about 98%.
Wow. I'm surprised because my experience of DBT and referring people to DBT was back when I worked with a lot of teenagers. And it was trendy, I don't know if it still is, I'm guessing it still is, for a 15-year-old girl who is having a lot of emotional problems and acting out and fighting with her parents every day and very distressed and has suicidal thoughts, to be assumed that she's a budding borderline, as they call it,
right,
and that DBT is really the only answer, and probably a good answer. And then, but the 15-year-old didn't want any kind of counseling, and so then, the system, or me involved in the system, or the family, would end up referring, and then I would always have a pretty pessimistic thought about them completing it, because they were pretty erratic and chaotic just on an hour-to-hour basis, let alone like sticking with something for 12 months, especially when I imagined the class would require meaningful participation, right? You'd have to do the homework and at least talk. And, some of these kids were not about that at that stage. So, so I'm guessing you don't get those kinds of clients.
My class is for adults, so I don't work with teens, 18 and above. So we have a pretty broad age range of ages in my class, but we don't work with teens per se. There are DBT programs that actually incorporate family as opposed to just the identified teen client.
And the parents go through the program too?
Yeah, parents and everybody attends skills training together.
Wow.
And I don't know about the research on that, though I suspect a person could feel confident that it would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, DBT, so give us an idea of what DBT, well, before I go to there, so the people who come to you, are they self-referred? Are they wanting DBT?
They're wanting skills training. That's who I get. So I don't actually run a standard program which has those three components I mentioned earlier. I run a DBT skills class, and I don't require that my students engage in one-on-one DBT therapy. I do require them that they be in some kind of therapy, but it doesn't have to be DBT. And the reason for that is because the research study that I worked on at the University of Washington was a dismantling study where they wanted to see what's the active ingredient in this therapy. So they had 3 conditions, 33 subjects per condition. First condition was standard DBT, which is the individual component plus the skills training. And the second condition was just individual counseling with no skills training component. Those folks, though, to control for time in a group, met once a week in what they called an insiders group, which was a social group essentially where they did interesting, fun stuff, bowling or movie or whatever. And then the third condition was people just getting skills training who did not have an individual counselor, who had a case manager who would link them to resources and provide support in crisis. Limited support, though. Anyways, and the reason for that third condition was because that's what most people in the country in community mental health clinics were getting. They weren't getting... The thing about individual DBT that makes it a little bit different from other kinds of therapy is that the therapist tends to be much, much more available for coaching calls between sessions.
Right. That's the model that Marsha Linehan found to be helpful, was that they're basically on call when the person is having a crisis of suicidal thoughts, and they're available. Yeah. And that's hard to facilitate if you're at a clinic, I guess. Is that the idea?
Well, community mental health clinics...
it's expensive, I guess.
Yeah, it is. But community mental health clinics are not generally set up for therapists to be on call like that. They rely on the crisis clinic, at least in the King County area where we live.
Or their own crisis line that doesn't involve the actual therapist. But this model is like the actual individual therapist is available in between sessions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's some flexibility of limits within that, open to interpretation. I have a friend I think is a very good DBT person who does not take calls after 10 p.m.
Well, so by omission, you're saying that the standard for DBT is to take calls after 10 p.m.
A person could take a call at any time.
What's the typical, interesting.
Yeah.
And do you get paid for that as a DBT person?
Well, I don't know how therapists work it. I could imagine somebody asking to be paid for the phone consult time, especially if it's waking them up in the middle of the night. I mean, that's disruptive. I heard a friend of mine who was very good DBT therapist said at one point he was getting calls in the middle of the night from this one client, and it was really disrupting his life and his sleep. And so he just made that part of therapy is to target. They call it targeting. That's kind of a
interesting word.
Yeah. Anyways, what he did is he just made that a topic of therapy, which is to get this client such that she didn't need to call him in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
So he could sleep.
Yeah, so Linehan, and I agree, found that when a person who has borderline or something related, a therapist or a counselor who's there all the time, it's a huge relief to them and something that is very curative. I would call it a corrective experience. I think Linehan would call it some kind of emotional regulation.
She might call it a corrective experience nowadays. She might.
Okay. And that is one of the struggles, actually, of when I work with people with personality disorders. They often will increase their dependence on me, which is fine and good and corrective. And I have other things I have to do with my week. And I have a model of pretty much maximum 1 hour a week, and so there's sometimes some negotiation of boundaries around that. And, but if I had a different mindset or a different lifestyle that allowed for such a thing, I might allow that. It's a compassionate thing that these DBT people do. But anyway, so getting back to the study.
Oh yeah.
They found, I'm guessing that the class was quite successful in relation to the other elements of the DBT model. Is that what you're saying?
I am. So standard DBT helps. And
what do you mean by standard DBT?
So that's individual counseling plus skills training. Okay. That's standard. That's a standard model. And
the therapist is there 24/7 kind of.
Yeah, available. Though I like what you're saying. I think DBT therapists still do have boundaries that they want to observe, limits that they want to observe. So that it's not like you can call me any old time. It's like if you're calling me and it's disrupting my life, then we're going to have to deal with it, because if I burn out, I'm no good to you.
Right.
So that's on the table. Therapists are self-care for therapists is really important, which is a lot of why there's a team, because there's a team of therapists supporting somebody. It's very
right. That's another great part of the model that I think is hard to facilitate sometimes, and to have it formalized in the model, I think helps to make sure that we do that. It's essentially self-care,
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the study, if you had asked me at the beginning who's going to be helped here, I would have said the standard bit's going to help, and individual counseling without skills training is going to be helpful, and just skills training alone isn't going to do anything for anybody.
Interesting.
And it actually turns out that individual counseling without skills training, they had a far weaker treatment response and greater dropout. And skills training without individual counseling was nearly as effective as standard DBT.
Wow.
I was the skills trainer on that research study, so you can imagine I feel pretty good about that. And so as a result, I changed the way...
Did you just throw the data into the individual therapist's face and say, I'm better than you?
Well, of course.
The data has proven I am effective and you are not.
Of course I did that.
Yeah.
I still do that.
Yeah.
So what I did is, though, I changed the way I ran my DBT, the DBT part of my private practice. And I no longer required that my clients be an individual DBT, and I no longer required that their individual therapist attend a consult meeting that I ran.
Do other DBT people frown at this? Because it's still the standard model is to have individual DBT.
Yeah.
Certified DBT, right? You have to be that's the other thing. You have to be certified as a DBT person to do this sort of thing, right?
You don't have to be certified, but that certification has come and it's available, and it's probably a good thing.
Are you certified?
No, they don't certify skills trainers. They only certify individual counselors.
Okay. But you don't have to, like you could be a CBT therapist, you could be a DBT therapist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a break, and after that, I want to hear about the specific skills that you teach.
Sure.
I think that's a part that might be interesting to people. The second half of this episode, in which we talk about dialectical behavior therapy, is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you're not a patron, the content will end now. But if you're a patron, then you get to hear the rest of the episode, which is me and Bob talking about dialectical behavior therapy. So if you're not a patron yet, go to patreon.com and become a patron. And then you'll get instructions on how to access the rest of this episode, along with hundreds of other patron-exclusive episodes, in which I do deep dives into various things like narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, borderline, and so on. So go to patreon.com, become a patron of the podcast.